Per me si va nella città dolente, per me si va nell'eterno dolore, per me si va tra la perduta gente. Giustizia mossi il mio alto fattore, fecemi la divina podestate, la somma sapienza il primo amore. Dinanzi a me non for cose create, se non eterne io d'eterno duro, lasciate ogni speranza, voi ch'intrate. Okay, my Italian-speaking friends are gonna have to forgive me. Knowles, I'm sorry if you're listening to this. That was my attempt at pronouncing some of the terza rima of Dante. When we have Catherine Illingworth on here, I will ask her to do what I'm sure will be a much better job. But I did not want to pass through this episode on Divine Comedy without luxuriating in some of these incredible syllables. It's amazing the way the poem drives forward in Italian. That was the inscription over the gate of hell. And one of those lines is one of the most famous ones in the whole poem. Lasciate ogni speranza voi ch'intrate. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. And it's an interesting line in part because, as we're going to get into, Virgil, who, as we said last week, is Dante's guide, the pilgrim, the narrator Dante, speaker Dante's guide through hell and purgatory, is a little bit ambivalent, ambiguous about whether this is a helpful piece of advice, let's say, or damnation for all eternity. Now, of course, there's no bones about this. In hell, you are damned for all eternity, right? This is not like everyone's going to come out okay. There's no suggestion that I can see in this poem of like eventually you'll be free. But one of the things that I find most moving about the poem is that it has this incredibly capacious moral sensibility. And the reason why it is structured the way it is, with so many crevices and circles and mountains and planets, right? The reason why, in some fundamental sense, is because Dante has an enormous aptitude for moral nuance and the many different forms that human life can take, the many different kinds of depravity we can fall victim to, and the many different kinds of virtue that we can aspire to and choose. And that is why there are all of these different levels. It's not because he's so interested in condemning people. Actually, that's kind of our fascination than his. His fascination is with the enormity of God's justice, which is perfect in every particular and has a place for each thing, right? Each activity, each event. I'm not even necessarily committed to the idea that we need to take these judgments on Dante's part as his, definite statement about who's going to end up in hell and who's not. I do think he puts people he doesn't like into hell, right? He puts bad popes, for instance, into hell. And that a lot of the stuff that we talked about last week with the Welfs and Ghibellines, the political intrigue he was involved with, that's the source of a lot of the kind of inner reference to Florentine politics that you get in this text. Plus, I do think he's articulating a sense of divine justice and retribution for evil acts here. But I also think that what he's doing is he's depicting the afterlife as the kind of ultimate eternalization of where the heart is most directed. Where your treasure is, there your heart shall also be. And these souls, these shades that we find in hell, purgatory, and paradise are ultimately reaping the consequences, the rewards or the punishments of their own kinds of love, right? The thing that they've been most devoted to, the way that they have shaped their soul. Aquinas, and it's very clear that this comes up in the poem, Aquinas has this idea that, after the soul leaves behind its earthly body, it is effectively frozen in some kind of shape, and that when we are reincarnated, we will be given a body that reflects the contortions of our soul or the nobility, the elevation of our souls. And in some sense, that's kind of what's going on here. We're getting a picture of human life as a kind of eternally and cosmically significant, irrevocably significant set of choices about how to orient and shape the soul. And so, lasciate ogni speranza voi ch'intrate, right? This is the final answer, yeah? You're not getting out of here. And in fact, right, hope, it would in some sense be crueler than abandoning hope. So there's really, in that sense, it's incredibly grim. Although there are a number of other interpretations that Virgil opens it up to, which I'll leave you to go and explore on your own. In any case, let me talk a little bit about the structure of this thing, because that in itself is a work of art, and I think it's good for us to get a map of the territory as we look. As I said before, we're going to look kind of at a bird's eye view of this poem rather than progressing in necessarily chronological order, which if you go and read the poem, you should do. One nice thing about it, these canticles are divided into canti, singular canto, and when I was revisiting it for this series of episodes, I did notice the canti themselves, each canto is pretty short. So if you set yourself the task of like, I'm going to read one canto a week, that would really not be, I mean, it'd take you a long time to get through, but that would not be an unmanageable thing. And it would give you time to chew over each of the pieces, the portions of the text. But let's talk about the introduction. The worse inflation and the Biden economy get, the more important it is to check out Rocket Money. This is a great way to start getting your finances in order. You may remember them as Truebill back in the day when they started to sponsor Young Heretics. They were called Truebill, and they still do now as Rocket Money what they did then, which is to help you cancel your unwanted subscriptions. This is key. There are so many things that just kind of roll over. Maybe you get a free trial and you wanted to watch one show and they kind of suckered you in, and then you forget about it, and then you're paying like these huge sums of money every month. Rocket Money can help you with that. They can also help you to manage your finances more generally, because they have grown from a bill management app into a full-on personal finance empowerment tool. They help over 3.4 million people with budgeting, lowering bills, canceling subscriptions, and more. And on average, they save each of their members $700 a year. Think about what you could do with just $700, and you could save more. Who knows? You can start canceling your unused subscriptions at rocketmoney.com/heretics. It's rocketmoney.com/heretics. You've got to go to that link for my listeners only, rocketmoney.com/heretics. So the structure of this poem. I said last week that if you like Easter eggs, and if you like numerology, and if you feel sometimes like that guy from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia in the meme where he's putting up the, pins on the board and he's saying like, this guy is linked to this guy and he's drawing this crazy conspiracy theory. This is the poem for you. There are almost innumerably many ways that you can kind of lay out the scheme of how this poem works, and they almost all have something to tell you about what Dante is doing. In that sense, it's a remarkably perfect construction. The first thing to be aware of is the number 3. I talked about this last week when we talked about Dante's relationship with Beatrice, which begins when he's 9, and then there was 9 years in between their kind of 2 great encounters. So 3s and 3s, right? The divine, the heavenly number 3 plus 3 is like really important. And in the Commedia, we have 3 canticles of 33 canti each, plus 1 extra introductory canto, which I read to you from last week. And that's the kind of, in the middle of our life's path after he's diverted, right, from his life's journey. And that's what gets him to sort of the entryway to this grand adventure. It's epic, right? Because we should remember it is an epic, right? That's why Virgil's there. And in some sense, he's trying to top other epics that have gone before, like those of Virgil. So we've got 33, 33, and 33, which is 3 times 33 plus the 1. That's 100 cantos or canti altogether. And in total, that's 14,000 lines. In terza rima, as I read to you from the beginning, that's A, B, A, B, C, B, C, D, C, and so forth. And you can hear that, right? Per me si va nella città dolente, per me si va nell'eterno dolore, per me si va tra la perduta gente. Dolente, gente, right? And then the next thing is going to end with ore, right? Because dolore. And then the next thing is going to end with fatore, right? Dolore, fatore. So we've got dolente, gente, dolore, fatore, podestate, create, amore, and so on and so forth. And this is the way that the rhyme scheme works all the way through. And then we have more 3s to talk about. So the structure of hell is like this big kind of conical gash in the earth, and it goes right down to the center where Satan lives. There are famously 9 circles, although some of them have subdivisions and little pockets and so on and so forth. And once you get through to the bottom of hell, you get to the center of the earth and you kind of flip upside down, and then you go up to the mountain of purgatory, which also has 9 rings, and it reverses the procedure that you have going on in hell. So we'll talk about these 2 in a second because they're kind of really like most closely related, and then heaven's a little bit different. But in hell, the sins go from least bad to worse, and this is what I mean by some of the kind of moral nuance. It's like the punishment literally fits the crime in that it is in some sense an outgrowth of the crime, and that means that sort of lower grade sins are nearer to the crust of the earth and are not punished in quite the same way. And worse sins get worse punished as you go down. The 9 circles are further subdivided into 3 sets of 3, and they can be neatly mapped onto the 3 parts of the soul. I told you we were going to talk about that last week. Remember, the Platonic soul has your kind of animal desires, which is the lowest part of you. Then your thumos, your audacity, your courage, or your anger. And that's the kind of spirited part of you. And then your logos, your reason, the thing that makes you most fully human, and the thing that kind of connects you to the eternal and absolute principles of the divine. And just as Aristotle says that the best kinds of government are worst when corrupted, so the noblest part of us does, for Dante, the worst kinds of sins when it falls. And so the top part of hell is concerned with sins of lust, right? And lust is kind of this physical, this failure of the physical appetite. So they're actually kind of the least bad sins. And we're going to get into some of them in a bit. When you go down to the area of thumos, you have violence against various different beings, right? Oneself, others, God, nature. All kinds of failures of thumos are misdirections of the spirited passion. And then you have betrayal, right? That at the very, very bottom, and this is an inconstancy, falsehood, right? These are misuses of reason and logic, right? The kind of fraud especially is bad because that's like using your wisdom and your logic to defraud somebody is like the kind of worst kind of evil. And then that structure is effectively sort of flipped on its head. So you have the worst sins have to travel farthest up the mountain of purgatory, so they start farthest at the bottom, and then the least bad sins are purified at the top of purgatory until you get to the Garden of Eden, in fact. And so at the Garden of Eden, you have the inflection point where Dante and Beatrice are going to take off into the 9 spheres of heaven. And heaven is in outer space. And as I mentioned, we're going to talk a lot about that with Catherine, with my friend Catherine Illingworth. It's not a place, Beatrice at one point says, it's not like they actually live like on these planets so much as that these planets are the most appropriate physical place for them to manifest themselves, because they actually operate in a sphere kind of totally beyond your physical experience. But in heaven, right, there are 7 virtues, and they are fortitude, justice, and temperance. Prudence, fortitude, justice, and temperance are the classical ones, followed by faith, hope, and love, the Christian ones. And so all of these things can be mapped kind of neatly and interestingly onto one another. You can read them sort of side by side if you want. You can, read one canto of Inferno and then move on to like a corresponding canto in Paradiso, and then move on to one in Purgatorio and so forth. But you can also just read from Inferno to Purgatorio to Paradiso all the way through. And that's how most people read. That's how it's supposed to be read. But if you, after that, you want more, you can kind of do more comparison in this other way. So that's the map. That's where we're going. What's going to happen to us? Well, I talked a little bit about it earlier on, but now I want to get into some passages so that we can explore more deeply. And the first thing that I want to talk about is this woman, Francesca da Rimini. Now, Francesca is a famous story, one of the most famous portions of the Divine Comedy, and it is closely related to the whole kind of poetic lineage that I was situating Dante in last week. In some ways, Francesca, who is in the circle of the lustful, because she was an adulteress in this version of the story, right? In some ways, she is picking up the concerns that Dante had with merely human love and merely human love poetry in Vita Nuova, right? The need for something more is embodied in this kind of corruption of Eros. And so what happens in this version of the story, and this was a real person, Francesca da Rimini, and it seems as if Dante may have stayed with her family in Ravenna, which is where he ended up, right, in his exile. But it's not clear to what extent he's representing a real, historical story and to what extent he's sort of narrativizing and mythologizing. But basically, the way the story goes in Dante is that Francesca and Paolo have this affair. Paolo is the brother of her husband. Her husband is Gianciotto, crippled John. And so she's married off for political reasons to this kind of unappealing character. And she commits adultery. And she still kind of nurses this as like she was wrong. She was led astray, even in hell. But what is happening now to Francesca and Paolo is that they are buffeted about forever without rest on the wind, right? They are moving in this kind of never to be satisfied circle, almost in pursuit of one another. And this is, of course, what I mean when I say that this is a kind of physicalization, a formalization of what was going on in their hearts, the kind of unsatisfiable desire, the insatiable lust that leads to the breaking of the marriage vows, and will condemn them to this like eternity in kind of discontent together. So let me read to you what Francesca has to say about her own adultery. So I'm moving now to this translation by Anthony Esselin, who is a more recent translator of the text. These are separate editions. The Mandelbaum translation I used last week was all bound together, but this is a modern library, very handsome editions, and so that you can get another translator as we go. So he says, Dante, the narrator, the pilgrim, says, "I now begin to hear arising wails of sorrow. I have come where the great cries batter me like a wave pounding the shore." We're in Canto 5, by the way, of the Inferno. "It is a place where all light is struck dumb, moaning as when high winds from east and west wrestle upon the sea in a fierce storm. That hellish cyclone that can never rest snatches the spirits up in its driving whirl, whisks them about and beats and buffets them. And when they fall before the ruined slope, and then the shrieking, the laments, the cries, then they hurl curses at the power of God." So this is, obviously no fun. And they are, they're being buffeted by wind. They're being racked up against the crags. And they're, and even though they don't have bodies, they, throughout this poem, they will feel pain. So here is what then Francesca has to say about her own damnation. She says, "O living spirit, courteous and good, traveling the black night to visit us, who left the world dyed purple with our blood. Were he who rules the universe our friend, we would entreat him, praying for your peace, for you have pitied us, our twisted fate." This is an interesting thing about Dante the Pilgrim, is that he has a lot of compassion for a lot of these sinners, and in fact identifies with a lot of them. When he meets Brunetto Latini, his teacher, whom he has in hell for sodomy, although that's not something that, there's no evidence of this outside the poem, but he's telling us that Latini had sex with men, right? When he meets him, there's this incredible outpouring of feeling and grief and pity for the pain of the damned, which also translates, of course, into Dante's own sort of identification, right? Because he knows he can be lustful, right? He can be overwhelmed by physical desire as well, and so they respond to him, in kind. They're grateful to see him. Where the Po rushes with all its tributaries down to its sea harbor, that it may have peace in that place, lies the town where I was born. Love, that flames soonest in the gentle heart, seized him for that sweet body which was snatched from me. And how it happened hurts me still. Love, which allows no loved one not to love, seized me with such a strong delight in him that as you see it will not leave me yet. Love led us to one death. The realm of Cain waits for the man who quenched us of our lives. So her husband killed them when he found them in the act. That he's consigned to another to a lower circle of hell for violence, but she is buffeted about because of her love, the love which stays with her and to which she sort of sings a hymn that you could almost imagine coming from Dante's earlier poetry. And so now you see what I'm getting at here, right? Francesca is in some sense though all that he fears in himself, or at least all that he fears he may have led others into, because in a second we'll find that she was also reading, right? She's a reader, and the ideas of romantic love, the romance of adultery that she found, especially in the tales of Lancelot and Guinevere, are going to be what have led her into this eternal torment of always being in sort of unsatisfied desire. She says, "There is no greater grief than to recall a time of happiness while plunged in misery, as your teacher knows. But if so great a longing urges you to know about the first root of our love, then I will tell you, speaking through my tears, one day we two were reading for delight, about how love had mastered Lancelot. We were alone and innocent and felt no cause to fear. And as we read, at times we went pale as we caught each other's glance, but we were conquered by one point alone. For when we read that the much longed for smile accepted such a gentle lover's kiss, this man, whom nothing will divide from me, trembled to place his lips upon my mouth. A pander was that author and his book. That day we did not read another page. And all the while one spirit told their tale, the other wept so sadly that I fell, for pity of it, to a death-like faint, and I dropped like a body stricken dead. Very dramatic, and it is something that's going to happen multiple times to Dante, that he's going to lose consciousness in some way or another. And here, the pity of it, but also I suspect his implication in it, right? This is somebody who has taken seriously the kinds of poetry that Dante has been inspired by, right? I mentioned the courtly love poetry. Lancelot and Guinevere is directly kind of mentioned here. And this is the danger, right, of falling too much in love with love as a merely human thing, right, without subordinating it to the higher laws of heaven. And so by leaving that behind here in this kind of relatively early stage of hell, Dante is now compelled onto some exploration of how this, thing that can go so terribly astray, that can be so fleshified, so eroticized in the worst way, how that can be redeemed. And so I want to read now from some sort of corresponding sections in Purgatorio and Paradiso to see how Dante is really working out these ideas throughout this vast architecture and structure of the cosmos. So let's turn now to Purgatorio, and let's find the lustful again in Purgatory, where they are being cleansed by fire. And this is, of course, the grand difference between hell and Purgatory is hope, right? Is not just the hope, in fact, but in Purgatory, the certainty of eventual success, right? You are moving eternally in both places. You are always buffeted about in hell. You are always walking around or traveling in Purgatory. But in Purgatory, you are moving somewhere. And in hell, you are moving nowhere, right? You are just moving forever. And actually, that is this kind of infernal mimicry of the divine motion, which is kind of perfect and stable, right? But that's a motion, a stillness of perfect satisfaction. This is a kind of immobility of total unsatisfaction, right? Total deprivation. And in the middle of that is Purgatory, which is a journey, right? Which is actually something that has hope. And that is the one thing that nobody in hell has, right? Lasciate ogni speranza, leave behind all hope. And when I said that that there are shades of that, part of what I meant is that, for instance, Virgil and the great sages of antiquity are in this kind of shadowland that's not really hell. It's part of the architecture of hell, but it's limbo, right? It's this thing where there's kind of they don't have Christ, they don't have redemption, and so they can't really, they can't be saved, but they get to sort of sit and talk about the true, the good, and the beautiful, as we indeed like to do on this show, but they have no hope. It's crippled hope, right? And this is the thing that makes it fundamentally an experience of, that's at least adjacent to damnation, even though in some ways they're having a more pleasant experience of eternity than the people in Purgatory who are suffering in the refiner's fire. But they have hope, right? They are going somewhere, and this is kind of the crucial dimension of their salvation that makes their experience one of joy. Let us turn now to book 25 of Purgatorio to talk about lust. If you are hiring in any capacity, you need Indeed. I know I have a lot of listeners and friends that run small businesses or are in charge of hiring at various businesses. This is something that is obviously necessary. You need good people, but it's not necessarily the best use of your time as the manager, right? You want to devote your time where it matters most. That is to coming up with the products and the services that are going to serve your customers. That's why you got into this. That's why you care about it. And you need good people to help you with that, but you don't need to be spending your valuable time rifling through a bunch of irrelevant resumes, because a lot of the time you're going to get stuff that's just not even like the right fit at all. Indeed is the hiring partner where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. They are the only job site where you're guaranteed to find quality applications that meet your must-have requirements, or else you don't pay. They get great results. You can start hiring right now with a $75 sponsored job credit when you go to Indeed.com/heretics. That's Indeed.com/heretics for a $75 job credit. Indeed.com/heretics. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire. You need Indeed. So I mentioned that Dante puts his teacher, Brunetto Latini, into hell in the circles of violence as a sodomite. And he and the other sodomites, which is to say men who have sex with men, right, are forced across the burning plains, burning sands, and fires rained upon them. And this is going to disfigure them, at the resurrection, and this will be their fate forever. This is not something that Dante is happy about or celebrates. It's something, in fact, that he's kind of really moved with pity by. And what's really interesting, and what is going to get me into sort of talking about this inflection point of sex, lust, and eros, right? Because the whole time we're talking about how do you purify eros, how do you agapify it, right? Is that there are also sodomites in purgatory. And now I'm not trying to there are arguments out there that this suggests a kind of liberalizing attitude on Dante's part toward homosexuality or men sleeping with men. I don't totally buy that, but I do think he has a kind of bigness of heart that enables him to see the moral nuances here. And one of the things he's doing is he's saying there is like a kind of purely violence against nature aspect to sodomy, he thinks. But then also there's an element of it that is kind of lust, like a heterosexual lust, right? That it's kind of it's over sexuality, it's over sexualizing, and in this ring of purgatory, you get homosexuals and heterosexuals both kind of walking in a ring of fire and purifying themselves of the desires that led them to perdition, right? And what's interesting about that is it suggests that like lust in general, right, is a force which can lead in destructive directions, but which in some sense, right, is not in itself inherently evil, right? That lust is sort of the corruption of something, which in itself has a kind of moral neutrality to it, or is as many possible directions that it can go. And this is the erotic impulse, right? So the overdoing of eros, right? The superfluity of erotic desire is what translates into luxuria, into lust in purgatory, and is then purified and refined into a kind of chaste love for gays and straights, right? And this is where I think we begin to understand like what Dante is doing with his love for Beatrice, because his love for Beatrice is also sexual, as we've talked about, and it is also extreme, right? It's all encompassing. In the beginning of Vita Nuova, it totally knocks him flat, and the whole question that's been animating him is how is he going to move through that experience into something refined and joyous, right? And so at this point, and we're in now Canto 25 of the Purgatorio, we get something very odd that I think actually is significant, and that is this long disquisition, philosophical, scholastic disquisition upon the relationship between body and soul. Because Dante asks, at this point they've been joined by Statius, who is another Latin poet that became, in Dante's telling, secretly a Christian from reading Virgil. And so it's even more poignant that Virgil cannot gain Christian salvation because his vision has kind of prompted a Christian conversion in Statius. And so that is why we are able to find him here in Purgatory. And Dante the pilgrim asks Statius, how is it that these beings, which are disembodied or post-embodied, right, that don't yet have their resurrected bodies, are able to suffer, right? How are they feeling the flames? And even if they're not disfigured by them, they're still feeling like a kind of pain, right? So here's what Statius says, and this is a long disquisition on the relationship between body and soul. Son, if your mind will gather in and keep my words under your watch, they'll shed light upon that how you've asked about, your first and perfect blood, which isn't all absorbed into the thirsty arteries, but stays like untouched food upon the table, takes from your heart the power to shape and form each human member, as that second blood can feed them all by coursing through the veins. Purified once again, this blood descends to a part which it's best to leave unnamed. Now, bear with me here, because there's usually when we get into like these kind of medieval medical ideas, people immediately dismiss them as sort of like pre-scientific, but there's something much more important going on here. There they unite. This was the mother's blood unites. Hers formed to undergo, his to create, for this was pressed forth from a perfect place. Then blood on blood, it starts to operate, clotting at first, then quickening into life what its matter has made coagulate. this active power having become a soul, such as a plant possesses, with this difference, one's on its way, while one has reached its goal, it keeps on working till it moves and feels like a sea sponge. At this stage, it begins to organize the powers its seed conceals. Now, I mentioned that there's a lot of Aquinas that we could see here. There's a lot of crossover here that we could see between Dante and Aquinas. What we are getting here is a description of conception. And like Aquinas, Dante thinks that the soul, as it comes into being at conception with the blood of the mother and the father, which is, you might take just to mean the kind of vital forces of the mother and the father, begins a development through all the different parts of the soul. And we've talked about how in Aristotelian psychology, there are beings that only have the nutritive soul part, like plants. And this is why Stacia says, so for plants, that's the end of it, right? You just get to the nutritive part. Humans also go through that stage, but they're on their way, right, to a kind of further flowering outward. So it's not that our fleshly desires, our like basic kind of vegetal wants and feelings are transcended. It's that they grow outward into something more. So this is the first ingredient, right, of this kind of complicated answer to this question. Well, how is it that, some kinds of lust can be in hell and purgatory? How is it that my lust for Beatrice, my desire for Beatrice, can be purified? Well, it's because it's not that this lust is inherently evil. It's that it's incomplete, and if left alone, it will be kind of fetal and even abortive, right? And instead, what it has to do is grow out. Milton has a similar gesture, a similar idea in the conversation between Adam and Raphael. It has to grow out into more spiritual things, never leaving behind the embodied core of what it is. So here it goes. I find this very exciting, even though it's kind of arcane and obscure. How the animal becomes a child, a speaking being. And this is a word from fante, right? To speak, right? How it turns from this animal thing with kind of animal soul into a rational soul. This you still don't see. A point so hard it made a wiser man lose his way. And this is Averroes he's referring to here. He made a wiser man lose his way, for since he could not detect an organ for it, his philosophy divides the person from the intellect. Now that's an error that we are still very familiar with, right? Divides the person from the intellect because we can't find an organ that has the intellect. And he said, well, there must just be flesh and mind, right? We must be dualists. But no. At the moment in the fetus, when the brain's articulation is complete, the first mover in gladness at that hour turns to so fine a work of nature's art, breathing a new spirit, replete with power, drawing the active virtues it may find to its own substance, making them one soul which lives and feels and turns its turning mind upon itself. God caps the creation of every human soul. The mother contributes something, the father contributes something, but God contributes the logos, right? And in that moment, you've become a human being, right? And this is, sometimes this has been, I think, falsely used to suggest that, like, the idea of the quickening was that their, fetuses weren't people. No, this is the generation, right? The natural development of something, which is the point at which the spiritual and the divine touches the fleshly and the material. And that idea, that notion that, when God reaches down to place the logos into a physical being, that's the whole of humanity in Dante's vision. I think it's not an accident that this whole disquisition comes right at the middle of Purgatorio, which is the middle of the whole poem, right? This incarnate divinity, right? Which is, of course, fundamentally Christian, this incarnate divinity and the touching of logos into the natural development of an organic being, is what Dante is going to, I think, grab onto as the difference between lust and love, right? If you think of Eros, right, as this kind of very fleshly but also very spiritual experience that he's had with Beatrice, I mean, if you think of that as the kind of inflection point, you can think of that drawn down into the flesh to become lust, or you can think of it drawn up into the spirit to become agape, and that's because of what we are, which is these, ensouled beings, these hylomorphic entities. Okay, so the first mover in gladness inserts the logos. And that these words of mine may seem less startling, think of the sun's heat that turns the sap and water into wine in a vine full of grapes. When the fate's thread is spent, the soul must slip the body's ties, bearing our human potencies away with the divine. The lesser powers are mute, but memory, intelligence, and will grow far more active then, and more acute. So then now we're describing death, right? So how is it that these bodies are able to, or these bodiless souls rather, are able to feel pain? Well, they have essentially been rarefied out into whatever is that logos element of us, right? Or whatever is that spiritual element of us, let's say, because all the parts of the soul seem to, in some sense, have a consequence here. But the question is going to become, right? You have been like, you are a point at which the divine has touched, the spiritual has touched the flesh, right? The two things have come in union together, and therefore it is possible for the spirit to draw the flesh up into itself. It's also by the nature of relationship, the logos, the spirit, has made itself vulnerable to contamination by the logic of the flesh, which is the mere logic of sort of animal desire, right? And so it's not that the flesh is bad, it's that the flesh has a role to play, and that is in subordination being drawn up. And if it doesn't do that, in the end, you're going to be left with this kind of corrupted, crippled logos, right? So when the body passes away, what you are going to be left with is whatever has happened to your soul under the influence of this relationship between the spirit and the flesh. That's kind of what's happening. The lesser powers are mute, but memory, intelligence, and will grow far more active then and more acute. Instantly and amazingly, it falls all of its own to one of the two shores, where it first learns what road it has to take. Compassed by space, then in the other world, its forming power, that of the perfect blood, radiates round about as when it dwelled within the living member. So he's saying that this is it doesn't have a body, but it exerts a kind of forming power upon its surroundings. And as rays of sunlight are reflected in the rain, and all the various hues adorn the air, so now the soul, from where it must remain, takes of the air nearby, forms it anew, stamping it with our human faculties, sealing it with itself. As you see flame follow its fire when the fire changes place, so does the spirit follow its new form. This is remarkable. And so as you see flame follow its fire when the fire changes place, so does the spirit follow its new form. Since it's an air-made body come to light, it's called a shade. From air, the soul provides organs for all sensation, even sight, and by that body we can speak and smile. By it we shed the tears and heave the sighs, which you can hear on all sides of this hill, the shades arranged according as desire or any passion touches us. And this explains what you were wondering about. So the soul effectively, and this is true even now, right? The soul, people say, well, where's the soul on an MRI scan, right? Like you're all just meat, right? But no, the soul is known not by directly through the sense impressions, but by the impression it leaves on the material world, just like wind moving through rain, right? And so Statius is basically saying the soul now does that directly kind of into its surroundings, and becomes this shade. It forms for itself a kind of quasi-body out of the material of the environment. And eventually the resurrected body, I suspect, this is how I mean, these are kind of arcane mysteries, so your mileage may vary, but I suspect that what's being suggested here is that then, and this is definitely is, I think, the Aquinas version of it, like then at the resurrection, you're going to get a new body that, like this body, is kind of definite and made out of particular stuff rather than made out of the imprint that you make on the environment, but it's going to be shaped according to the shape that your soul has taken in purgatory, or before you went to hell or before you went to paradise. This is an amazing act of metaphysics. It is a beautiful work of poetry, and it is an answer, a kind of pivotal answer to all the questions that we have been fighting with and struggling with in the Inferno and in the Vita Nuova, right? This is the whole, there's a reason this comes in the middle, and it's because really what we're doing here is we're fundamentally understanding what we are and what Eros is to us. There is this amazing medieval idea which comes up in the Paradise, which we will turn to in a second. It comes up in the Paradise, though, that Venus, the planet Venus, which is, of course, is associated with the goddess of love, right, is the point at which Earth's shadow touches the heavenly spheres. And that's basically the kind of cosmic image version of this biological or psychological idea that logos is the point at which the divine finger touches the human person, right? All of it beautifully hangs together, and you can see why he had to write a whole poem about it, right? Because it's really the vision of all that we are and all that is, and it wasn't going to be satisfied just by a theological treatise, right? It was not going to be, just totally exhausted by making arguments. You have to show it and tell it in this poetical language that kind of gives you a feel for it. I mean, I love this idea of the flame passing from the fire passing with the flame and so forth to kind of give us the image of what a soul is without a body, but making imprints upon the world. Okay, let us turn now in our last moments of this episode to Paradiso, and then we will adjourn until we are joined next week by Catherine Illingworth. So, you know how your mom told you growing up you need to eat your vegetables? She was right, but it can be hard. And that is why Field of Greens is one of the best nutritional tools out there on the market. It is packed with a full spectrum of essential vegetables and fruits, plus science-backed herbs and prebiotics. It's a really great way to get a lot of the nutrients that you might not otherwise get just from a full day of eating. You guys know I like to keep healthy, and in general, I am paying attention to like my macros and all that stuff, but some of this stuff really easily slips by the wayside, and there are a lot of benefits you are leaving on the table if you're not getting this stuff into your diet. You will start to see a lot of success very quickly. You'll have a lot more energy. You'll look and feel healthier. It can help you to lose weight if that's what you're trying to do, although this is not a weight loss supplement. So all my gym bros out there, if you're bulking up, you can also enjoy Field of Greens. To help you get started, I got a 15% deal off on your first order and then another 10% when you subscribe for recurring orders. So that's a lot of discount at fieldofgreens.com. Use the promo code Heretics to get it. That's fieldofgreens.com, promo code Heretics, fieldofgreens.com, promo code Heretics. So I just want to touch on Paradise with you a little bit before we close out here, and then we're going to spend a lot of time in Paradise with Catherine next week. But I mentioned, of course, that Beatrice kind of set him off on this whole journey. Beatrice is the sign and symbol of, love, lust, agape, eros, everything, right? All these issues that we've been talking about kind of gathered up and purified and rarefied in her. It's also the case that Beatrice's prayers have kind of secured for Dante the Pilgrim guidance and leadership on the part of Virgil and others like Statius through these lower realms. Beatrice is not herself going to descend down there because she's way up in the highest heavens, but she is going to sort of pray for him that he might find more wisdom and get his head screwed on a little bit straighter, right? And so he's been journeying, waiting to see her, right? It's this reunion that he's been awaiting. And instead of the lover, right, the kind of Lancelot and Guinevere lover, what we get is actually a little boy terrified before his mother, because the beatified human is totally terrifying. And I think this is true if we were to meet any beatified human. Lewis says we would be tempted to worship that person because what people can be, the potential of what you are, every one of us, is so currently unrealized because of sin, and so incredibly transcendent in its essence, right? That if it were ever cleansed, if it ever attained beatitude, it would be something fearsome and beyond us. And so Beatrice kind of smacks him around a lot. She's very harsh with him. She rebukes him. She says, all right, it's time now. Leave all this stuff behind. Virgil has to be abandoned. And this is the real poignancy of it, which we have talked about a couple times now. Virgil has to be left behind. Beatrice becomes his guide, and he proceeds to move through the different spheres of heaven. And these are planets. As I said, Beatrice tells him it's not exactly that, the angels are like living on these planets so much as that this is the best way for them, the most accurate way for them to manifest themselves to your senses. So I'm going to actually read to you that portion of it, and then I will talk a little bit about where we're headed at the end of this. So this is Canto 4 of the Paradiso, and Dante, I think I may have read some of this passage to you in other episodes when I was talking about the relationship between the senses and reality and some of the quantum physics stuff we've gotten into. But it bears revisiting because I think we are now entering into the kind of answer that we're going to get to this question, right? What is love? How do I deal with all of my fleshly desires? Not just my sexual desires in point of fact, but my, appetites and my senses and so forth. He asks about whether these are people that actually that actually sort of occupy this physical space that he's looking at. And it's a similar question to the one he asks Statius. He's like, these guys don't have bodies. How do they feel pain? Now he says, are the angels really here? Like if I flew up in a spaceship, he wouldn't have asked it that way, but if I flew in a spaceship, would they be there? She says, they showed themselves to you here, not because this is their sphere, but as a sign for you that in the Empyrean, their place is lowest. Such signs are suited to your mind, since from the senses only can it apprehend what then becomes fit for the intellect. And this is why the Bible condescends to human powers, assigning feet and hands to God, but meaning something else instead. And Gabriel and Michael and the angel who healed the eyes of Tobit are portrayed by Holy Church with human visages. That which Timaeus said in reasoning of souls does not describe what you have seen, since it would seem that as he speaks, he thinks. He says the soul returns to that same star from which, so he believes, it had been taken when nature sent that soul as formed body. But his opinion is perhaps to be taken in other guise than his words speak, intending something not to be derided. If to these spheres he wanted to attribute honor and blame, or to attribute, honor and blame for what they influence, perhaps his arrow reaches something true. This principle, ill understood, misled almost all of the world once, so that Jove and Mercury and Mars gave names to stars. The other doubt that agitates you is less poisonous for its insidiousness is not such as to lead you far from me. To mortal eyes our justice seems unjust. That this is so should serve as evidence for faith, not heresy's depravity. But that your intellect may penetrate more carefully into your other query, I shall, as you desire, explain it clearly. So just to pause here, right? She said to him, the Bible condescends to human powers, assigning hands and feet to God, but meaning something else instead. And the Timaeus too, Plato's Timaeus, which is another kind of cosmology. In fact, it's very similar in some ways to this cosmology, not in every way, but this notion that the spheres have a kind of music, that they are realms of honor and ascending and descending honor, right? As you go higher up in heaven, of course, you get to, greater and greater virtues, greater and greater beatitude. At the moon, you have inconstancy, right? People who were inconstant but still virtuous, right? This is why the moon sort of changes its form and so forth. So it's all, as I said, a place for everything in its place, but not in the kind of literalizing physical sense that we might attribute to Dante. We are very apt, I think, when we read medieval texts to think, oh, those backwards primitives, they thought Sky Daddy was in the sky. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, their approach to this issue is much subtler and in some ways truer than our approach, which is like, well, if it's not on a chart or on an MRI scan somewhere, it can't be real, right? That is only real which can be measured. No, says Beatrice. Your intellect as the capstone of a physical soul, right, of a soul that inhabits a physical body, or so let's say an embodied soul, right, can only be accessed through matter. That's the being that you are. But the thing that you are accessing is not matter. And so sometimes it's necessary for scripture and for angels and for other beings, God perhaps even, to speak to you in images, right? To manifest himself, to incarnate himself even, in such a way that your fleshly mode of perception can lead you up. You can go through that perception up to the higher thing that is not in itself perceptible, and yet governs the motions and the rightness of, or wrongness of any embodied being, right? So this is the Platonic ladder Christianized. And the Platonic ladder says to us, yeah, your eros points you with this great physical passion in this way, but now we are learning, right, that because of that inflection point between logos and flesh, right, between spirit really and flesh, because of that inflection point, it is possible for the logos to draw the rest of the soul and even the physical person up toward itself. In some ways, if you think about Paul's spirit and flesh, right, he's not talking, I don't think, in a platonically dualist way about like body and soul. He's saying body and soul are intertwined, and the sarx, the flesh, is what happens when the body draws the soul down to its level. But the spirit is the pneuma, is what happens when the soul draws the body up to its level and operates according to its logic. And so that's where we're headed in Paradiso. This is the kind of final answer in Beatrice to the problem that began with Beatrice for Dante, which is how can I live in my body? How can I live in the world without becoming my body or becoming subject to these pagan, physical, fleshy powers? He says, Beatrice goes on and we'll conclude here. If violence means that the one who suffers has not abetted force in any way, then there is no excuse these souls can claim. For will, if it resists, is never spent, but acts as nature acts when fire ascends through force 1,000 times, though force 1,000 times tries to compel. So that when will has yielded much or little, it has abetted force, as these souls did, they could have fled back to their holy shelter. Had their will been as whole as that which held Lawrence fast to the great, and that which made of Mucius one who judged his own hand, then once freed, they would have willed to find the faith from which they had been dragged. But it is all too seldom that a will is so intact. And through these words, if you have grasped their bent, you can eliminate the argument that would have troubled you again and often. So she's saying the will, right, is the thing that is the kind of directive. It's like the rudder of the soul in some ways. If it resists, is never spent, but acts as nature acts when fire ascends, though force 1,000 times tried to compel. She's saying the human will is an irresistible force. If it is subject to God, right? And it can be so constant as to lead Mucius, which is an old Roman hero, to thrust his hand into the flames. And that is kind of where we're headed now, is sort of how is it that the will can be subject to God and so orient the body toward the soul rather than the other way around? Are we going to be governed and led, and we're going to think according to the spirit, or are we going to think according to the flesh? That's the fundamental choice that we have here. We're going to close with that. We'll pick it up again next week. Let's do the mailbag. 'Tis the season to be cozy, and that is why I am excited to be sponsored by Cozy Earth. If you are like me, then the minute the first leaf falls off the first tree, you become composed entirely of sweater, wool, and soup. That's my body composition is now 100% soup and sweater wool. And that means that I just want to be cozy all the time. Cozy Earth is a great way to do that. Their sheets are made from premium 100% viscose from bamboo, which means they're super soft, lightweight, and temperature regulating. So just because we are currently in cozy season doesn't mean that these sheets will only last you through the winter. You will also love them in the summer. You will be more comfortable year round. They were created to enhance people's lives by offering the softest, most luxurious, and responsibly sourced bedding in the world, with over 5,000 five-star reviews. So you will not be disappointed. I know I have not. Whether it's their best-selling luxury sheets, ultra-comfortable loungewear collection, or new bath collection, you will love shopping there. And my audience can save 35% on Cozy Earth at cozyearth.com/heretics. That's cozyearth.com/heretics to save 35%. cozyearth.com/heretics. Mailbag questions come to me on locals. Here's one from Mike. What should you do when your beliefs or ideology conflict with the prevailing beliefs of your interests? To break the cycle of pandemic reclusion, I've wanted to get out and exercise my hobbies, but I've run into a problem. My beliefs conflict with those stereotypical of my interest groups. My interest lies mainly in the arts, theater, singing, Shakespeare, and cosplay, and that work is where I come alive and thrive. Unfortunately, the theater and cosplay communities have slowly become the exclusive domain of rabid leftists. Yeah, many such cases. In the nostalgic Norman Rockwell past, differences in worldview may have been accepted and tolerated to produce a philosophically deeper and more well-rounded production, but the left's intolerance for anything other than its own dogma has seemed to end that era. In light of this ideological hegemony, I'd more likely than not be unable to connect with my fellow hobbyists on any deep philosophical level. Okay, so here are some options, because you are in a position that many people, I think, find themselves. I would count myself as somebody who likes a lot of the stuff that typically now gets quote unquote coded blue, right? And it's kind of a terrible double bind, because, you know, those things themselves are very beautiful and good. They are not always conformable to like conservative, to the most sort of straitjacketed and caricatured idea of conservative thought, right? If you think of yourself as somebody that can only kind of like live according to certain regimented rules, then like art is going to be tricky, because it exists in many ways to kind of play around the edges of the rules, to explore the variety of human experience. And so it's doubly bad, because you can get kind of accused of being a traitor if you go off into this, like, you know, into these other realms of life, which is just a recipe for a very small and straitjacketed sort of life. And it may also be true that the realms that you want to be in are occupied by a lot of people that, you know, you really disagree with, that are going to demand some kind of assent to propositions that you don't find moral. All of that is a real feature of life now. So you have a few options. One is to go away and build your own theater troupe, build your own school, build your own whatever. And that's always been my kind of impulse. That's sort of why I did this show. That's why I write in the places that I do, and the work that I do is kind of, you know, geared toward, well, okay, like, you know, the institutions are not really friendly to a lot of the real kind of earnest search for the good and the true and the beautiful, as I understand it. But I have a lot of, you know, kind of cultural capital that I've accumulated from those institutions, and I want to offer those to people that do care, because there are a lot of people, I think, that, you know, love the true, the good, and the beautiful, want to live righteous lives, and want, in fact, also to enrich those lives with art and literature. And so that means for me kind of like taking my show on the road in some ways. And you could do that too. You could form a theater troupe. You could say to a few people like, hey, we're going to put something on in my house. And it might be something that would start very, very small and then would grow, right? You might say like, we're going to just get together and do a reading of a Shakespeare play. Maybe start there. And then if we like it and if there's kind of some energy going on, then maybe we'll take roles and actually learn this play and learn a portion of it and just do it for some friends in my house, right? And you can find great joy, I think, in teaching that to people who maybe aren't naturally or automatically in that community. And sometimes you'll find that there's a lot of potential there, and there are more people than you think who haven't done that thing because they think it's hostile to them because, as you say, all the institutions are hostile to them. So that is one very real option. I don't want to discount that. Another is to develop a pretty thick skin and go in and just try to be the token conservative in these circles. That's not going to get you, I don't think, the same depth of communion, especially if you're dealing with people that really aren't open to your point of view, right? It might be a very, very lonely road to hoe, or you might find that there's some part of your life could be involved with pursuing these hobbies among people that aren't typically on your side, but maybe your side can begin to broaden out. You can begin to bring those people over to some of your core beliefs. And there is still the possibility for interaction and bipartisan engagement, even in this highly troubled time. And then, the other option is, as you say, to kind of go into the stereotypical pursuits of your ideological camp. That's my least favorite one, even though I do like those pursuits. I like gym bro culture and I like smoking cigars and drinking whiskey. But I said this on Twitter recently. I really don't think it's a recipe for a good life to seek out the things that are kind of culturally coded according to your political beliefs and then just build your whole personal life and personality around that. I think that's pretty bland. I think it ends you up with a small life. So my preferred course of action is always the build your own course of action. I find a lot of delight and joy in that. You might too, in the way that I just outlined. But just, your other option is, I guess, to make a go of it, to make the best of it as a kind of lonely warrior in hostile territory. Okay, good luck. Let me know what happens. Keep me posted and in touch. That's it for me this week. We will be back next week. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute, where I work. We put on 2 publications, the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. We also have a DC Center, the DC Center for the American Way of Life, at dc.claremont.org. And you can donate to help support us, which we really do appreciate now more than ever. Always need help from concerned citizens. It's claremont.org/donate, and let them know in the notes that you heard about us through Young Heretics. That's it for me. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.